What would you do if the love of your life betrayed you, and you caught every devastating moment on camera? In this gripping tale of love, lies, and revenge, Ethan uncovers a shocking secret that tears his family apart. But the real question is, how far will he go to reclaim his life? Watch to the end. This story will leave you speechless. Ethan sat at the dining table, his hands trembling as he clicked through the footage. He had debated this decision for weeks. Placing hidden cameras in his own home felt invasive, even wrong, but Marissa's distant behavior had left him no choice. Now, as the grainy video flickered on the screen, his heart sank. There she was, Marissa, in their living room. It was the same room where they had celebrated birthdays, shared laughter, and built a life together. But tonight, she wasn't alone. Sitting across from her was a man Ethan had never seen before, a man whose casual touch on her arm spoke volumes. Marissa leaned in, laughing softly, her body language intimate and unguarded. Ethan's breath caught in his throat. Pause. Rewind. Play. The man reached into his pocket and pulled out a small box. Marissa opened it, revealing a necklace. Her reaction wasn't just gratitude. It was joy, unrestrained and genuine. Ethan couldn't look away. Every smile, every touch, every glance, they were like knives carving into his chest. "Who is he?" Ethan whispered to the empty room, his voice cracking under the weight of his disbelief. Hours passed, but Ethan couldn't stop watching. He replayed the clip over and over, hoping to find some innocent explanation, some detail that would prove his suspicions wrong. But the evidence was irrefutable. Marissa wasn't just distant. She was hiding a life that didn't include him. Ethan stood abruptly, the chair scraping loudly against the hardwood floor. His vision blurred with tears as he paced the room. His mind raced with questions. Was it his fault? Had he worked too much? Had he missed signs that were obvious to everyone but him? He clenched his fists. No. He had given her everything: loyalty, love, the stability of a home. This wasn't his failure, it was hers. The realization brought a bitter wave of anger that nearly drowned out the pain. Ethan collapsed onto the couch, burying his face in his hands. The memories of their life together flooded back unbidden. Their first dance at their wedding, the way she'd cried with joy when they bought this house, the laughter they shared the day they painted the nursery. All of it felt like a cruel joke now, a facade that hid the truth. Suddenly, a soft knock on the door startled him. His heart leapt to his throat. Was it her? No, she wasn't supposed to be back until morning. He glanced at the time, 2:15 a.m. He hesitated before walking to the door. His fingers trembled as he reached for the doorknob. When he opened it, no one was there. Only the night greeted him, quiet and empty. A single envelope lay on the welcome mat, his name scrawled across the front. Ethan picked it up, his pulse quickening. The envelope felt heavy, foreboding, like the weight of another secret waiting to crush him. Returning to the couch, he tore it open. Inside was a photograph, Marissa and the same man from the video sitting together at a candlelit dinner. It wasn't just the picture that sent his world spiraling. It was the date scrawled on the back. Yesterday. Ethan's grip tightened around the photo as rage coursed through him. This wasn't just a betrayal. It was deliberate, calculated. "I'll find out everything," he whispered, his voice steady despite the storm brewing inside him. "You won't get away with this." Ethan stared blankly at the photograph for what felt like hours, his mind spinning in a storm of disbelief and betrayal. He couldn't bring himself to sleep, his thoughts looping endlessly back to the image of Marissa with that man, smiling as though nothing was wrong. By the time the first rays of morning sunlight peeked through the curtains, Ethan had made a decision. He needed to piece together the entire picture. As the children stirred awake, Ethan tried to muster a facade of normalcy. "Dad, can we have pancakes today?" his son asked, rubbing sleep from his eyes. Ethan forced a smile and nodded, even though the thought of eating made his stomach churn. He moved methodically through the routine, flipping pancakes, pouring orange juice, pretending everything was fine. Marissa would have done this on any other morning. The empty chair at the table felt heavier than he expected. After breakfast, Ethan called Patrick. "We need to talk," he said, his voice low and tense. Patrick agreed to meet him at their usual coffee spot near downtown. Ethan dropped the kids at school, the lingering sound of his daughter's laughter a bittersweet reminder of the innocence he needed to protect. At the cafe, Patrick was already waiting with 2 steaming cups of black coffee. "You look like hell," Patrick said, concern etched across his face. Ethan sat down heavily, sliding the photograph across the table. Patrick studied it for a moment before looking up. "That's rough, Ethan. Are you sure this is what it looks like?" Ethan's jaw tightened. "I saw them on camera, Patrick. It's not just this photo, there's more." Patrick let out a slow breath, leaning back in his chair. "Look, I don't know what to say, but before you do anything rash, you need more than a photo, more than just a few minutes of footage." Ethan's fists clenched under the table. "More?" he hissed. "How much more do I need? She's lying to my face, living a double life under my roof. How do I just sit with that?" Patrick leaned forward, lowering his voice. "I'm not saying do nothing. I'm saying if you confront her now, she'll deny it. You need to be absolutely sure before you blow everything up." Ethan sat back, the weight of Patrick's words sinking in. He hated how calm Patrick was, how logical. It felt wrong to wait, but deep down, Ethan knew he was right. He nodded slowly, his anger simmering just beneath the surface. Later that evening, Ethan tried to act normal as Marissa came through the door. "Long day?" he asked, his voice carefully measured. She smiled faintly and nodded, placing her bag on the counter. "Yeah, the charity stuff is really ramping up. I'll probably be out late again tomorrow." Ethan's stomach twisted. "That's good," he said, forcing the words out. "It's great you're so passionate about it." She glanced at him briefly, almost suspiciously, before walking upstairs. Ethan waited until he heard the sound of running water from the shower before retrieving her phone from her bag. His heart pounded as he opened her messages. Most of them seemed innocuous, chats with the charity group, reminders about meetings. But one stood out. A string of emojis, hearts, kisses, and a single line. "Can't wait for Friday." Ethan's breath hitched. Friday, 2 days from now. What was she planning? He quickly took a screenshot with his own phone before putting hers back exactly as he'd found it. The pieces were falling into place, but the picture they formed was even more devastating than he had imagined. As he sat in the darkened living room that night, watching the clock tick past midnight, Ethan felt a numb determination take hold. Patrick was right. He needed to know everything. Only then could he decide what came next. Ethan parked his car outside the office building, his hand lingering on the steering wheel. The weight of everything he had seen and uncovered in the past 2 days sat heavily on his chest. Patrick's calm, pragmatic voice replayed in his mind. "Be sure before you blow everything up," he'd said. But Ethan was already unraveling, barely holding it together for the sake of his children. He pushed through the glass doors and made his way to Patrick's office. The faint hum of conversations and the tapping of keyboards surrounded him, but it all blurred into the background. Patrick was at his desk, engrossed in his computer screen. He looked up as Ethan walked in, his expression softening with concern. "Close the door," Patrick said, his tone gentle but firm. Ethan obeyed, sinking into the chair across from him. "Patrick," Ethan began, his voice barely above a whisper, "I don't know how much longer I can keep this together." Patrick leaned forward, resting his elbows on the desk. "Tell me everything. What's happened since we talked?" Ethan pulled out his phone, scrolling to the screenshot of Marissa's text message. He placed it on the desk, his hands shaking slightly. Patrick picked up the phone, reading the message with a deep frown. "Friday?" Patrick asked. "That's tomorrow. Do you know what she's planning?" Ethan shook his head. "Not exactly, but it's clear this isn't just casual. She's planning something with him, and I don't know how far it's gone." Patrick set the phone down, sighing deeply. "Ethan, I hate to say it, but you need to let this play out a little longer. If you confront her now, you'll only get half-truths or denials." Ethan's frustration bubbled to the surface. "Let it play out? Do you know how hard it is to sit across from her at the dinner table knowing she's lying? Knowing she's making plans with him while I'm here holding everything together?" Patrick placed a steadying hand on Ethan's shoulder. "I get it, Ethan, I do. But if you want to come out of this with your sanity and your kids, you need to be smart about how you handle it. Reacting impulsively is only going to backfire." Ethan exhaled slowly, nodding despite the turmoil inside him. Patrick was right. He hated it, but he was right. "So what do I do?" Ethan asked, his voice raw. Patrick leaned back, rubbing his chin thoughtfully. "Tomorrow you follow her. Whatever this plan is, you need to know exactly what's going on. Don't confront her there, but gather enough proof to leave no room for her to deny it later." Ethan hesitated. The thought of spying on Marissa felt like crossing a line he didn't want to cross. But the image of that text message, of Marissa and the man in the photograph, fueled his resolve. "Okay," he said finally. "I'll do it." Patrick's expression softened. "Listen, Ethan, I'm here for you. Whatever you need, just let me know." Ethan nodded again, gripping the arms of the chair as if it could anchor him. "Thanks, Patrick. I don't know what I'd do without you." Later that night, Ethan sat in his car outside his house, staring at the glow of the kitchen lights through the window. He watched as Marissa moved around the kitchen, smiling absently as she typed on her phone. Was she texting him? Planning their rendezvous? Ethan's stomach churned at the thought. As he stepped inside, Marissa looked up, her smile faltering. "You're home late," she said, her tone light but guarded. "Work ran over," Ethan replied, keeping his voice steady. He kissed her on the cheek, pretending not to notice how she stiffened slightly at his touch. "Everything okay?" "Yeah," she said quickly, "just tired." Ethan nodded, his heart heavy. He knew tomorrow could change everything. For better or worse, the fragile facade they had maintained for so long was about to shatter. Ethan sat in the parking lot of the electronics store, gripping the small black box in his hands. It felt heavier than it should have, a physical manifestation of the weight pressing down on his chest. The label on the box read Discreet Surveillance Kit, and it promised state-of-the-art technology that could capture every detail, every moment. Ethan had no idea he'd ever need something like this. Yet here he was. He took a deep breath and started the car, the engine's hum filling the silence. The thought of installing cameras in his own home, his sanctuary, felt like a betrayal of everything he once believed about trust and love. But Marissa's lies had left him no choice. He needed the truth, no matter how ugly it was. When Ethan got home, the house was quiet. Marissa was out for her usual charity meeting, and the kids were asleep upstairs. Perfect. He pulled the cameras from the box and read the instructions, his hands steady but his mind racing. The devices were small, no larger than a deck of cards, and easy to conceal. Ethan chose 2 locations: the living room where Marissa often spent time on her phone, and the kitchen, a space she seemed to linger in more than usual lately. He set up the first camera behind a row of books on the living room shelf, angling it to capture the entire couch and coffee table. As he adjusted the lens, memories flooded back. Marissa sitting there, laughing at one of his terrible jokes. The kids playing board games on the rug. The warmth of those moments felt distant now, like a dream he could barely recall. In the kitchen, Ethan tucked the second camera behind a decorative vase on the counter. It provided a clear view of the table and the back door. He double-checked the live feed on his phone, ensuring everything was in place. The picture quality was sharper than he expected, every detail visible. He stared at the screen for a moment, a sense of unease creeping over him. This was real now. There was no turning back. As he finished, the sound of the front door opening sent a jolt of adrenaline through him. Ethan quickly slid the empty box into a cabinet and wiped his hands on his jeans, trying to appear casual. Marissa walked in, her face lit up with an easy smile. She placed her bag on the counter and kissed his cheek lightly, the gesture automatic and devoid of warmth. "Hey," she said, her tone breezy. "What are you up to?" Ethan forced a smile. "Just cleaning up a bit. How was your meeting?" "It went well," she replied, opening the fridge. "Busy though, we're planning a big fundraiser next month." "That's great," Ethan said, his voice steady despite the knot tightening in his stomach. He watched her carefully, every movement, every expression. Was this the face of a woman hiding something, or was he losing his mind? Marissa glanced over at him, her brow furrowing slightly. "You okay? You've been a little off lately?" Ethan shrugged, grabbing a glass of water to give his hands something to do. "Work's been stressful. Nothing to worry about." Her gaze lingered for a moment before she nodded. "Well, don't let it get to you too much. You've got a family to think about." The irony of her words hit Ethan like a punch to the gut. He nodded silently, not trusting himself to respond. She turned and headed upstairs, leaving him alone in the kitchen. Ethan sat at the table, staring at the live feed on his phone. The cameras were rolling, their tiny lights invisible to the naked eye. Every moment of her time at home would now be documented. For the first time in weeks, Ethan felt a small flicker of control. He didn't know what the cameras would reveal, but whatever it was, it would bring him closer to the truth. As he closed the app and slid his phone into his pocket, a single thought echoed in his mind. Be careful what you wish for. Ethan sat at the dining table again, the glow of his phone casting sharp shadows on his face. The feed from the hidden cameras was clear, capturing every angle of the living room and kitchen. It had been 2 days since he'd set them up, and so far nothing unusual had appeared. Marissa went about her routines, checking her phone, making dinner, tidying up the kids' toys. Each moment felt excruciatingly normal, and Ethan started questioning himself. Was he being paranoid? Was this all just a massive misunderstanding? But then, tonight, everything shifted. Ethan's finger hovered over the screen as Marissa appeared in the living room, her phone pressed to her ear. She seemed nervous, pacing back and forth. The audio wasn't perfect, but fragments of her conversation bled through. Yes, I know. No, it's fine. He won't find out. Friday is still good. Same place? Ethan froze. His chest tightened as a cold realization gripped him. She wasn't talking about the kids or a charity event. This was something else, something she didn't want him to know about. Marissa ended the call abruptly, glancing toward the stairs. Ethan held his breath, terrified she could somehow see him watching, even though she was in the next room. She sat on the couch, her phone still in hand, typing rapidly. Ethan's phone buzzed, startling him. He glanced at the notification, his daughter's school email, before refocusing on the live feed. Marissa stood suddenly, retrieving a small box from her bag. It was wrapped in silver paper, the kind Ethan recognized from their anniversary last year. She opened it briefly, smiling softly at whatever was inside, then tucked it back into her bag. Ethan's stomach churned. What was in the box? Who was it for? His mind raced through possibilities, each one darker than the last. The next day, Ethan couldn't concentrate at work. Every meeting felt like an eternity, every email a distraction from the thoughts consuming him. At lunchtime, he stepped outside and called Patrick. She's hiding something, Ethan said, skipping any pleasantries. I caught her on the camera last night. She's planning something for Friday. Patrick sighed, his voice cautious. What did you hear exactly? Ethan hesitated. Not much, just bits and pieces. But there was a box, a gift. She smiled like, I don't know, like it meant something. That's not enough, Patrick said after a pause. You need more than that, Ethan. You said Friday, right? Follow her. Find out where she's going and who she's meeting. Ethan clenched his fist. What if I'm wrong? What if this is just, I don't know, work-related or a charity thing? Then you'll know, Patrick replied firmly. But if you're right, you'll have proof. You'll have the truth. That evening, Ethan couldn't bring himself to look Marissa in the eye. Her smile seemed strained, her movements more deliberate. He wondered if she could feel his suspicion. As she kissed him goodnight and headed upstairs, Ethan lingered in the kitchen, staring at the vase concealing the second camera. The truth was within reach, but it terrified him. He wanted to believe there was still a way to fix this, to salvage what they had built together. But deep down, he knew some things, once broken, could never be made whole again. As the house settled into silence, Ethan pulled out his phone to review the day's footage. The camera's timestamp blinked in the corner as he watched Marissa scroll through her phone, smiling at messages he couldn't see. She typed something quickly, her face illuminated by the screen's glow. Then she laughed softly, a sound that once filled his heart with joy, now twisted into something unrecognizable. Ethan closed his phone, his hands trembling. He wasn't ready for what Friday might bring, but he also knew he couldn't turn back now. The first signs of betrayal were no longer deniable. They were staring him in the face. Ethan sat in his car outside the office, the engine idling. His thoughts churned like a storm, dark clouds of doubt and anger rolling through his mind. Friday had arrived, the day marked in Marissa's cryptic message. His stomach tightened as he gripped the steering wheel, staring at the clock on the dashboard. He wasn't ready for what the day might reveal, but he also knew he couldn't delay any longer. The truth wouldn't wait. He had arranged for Patrick to cover for him at work using the excuse of a family emergency. Ethan's real plan was far more personal. With his phone in hand and the location tracker app installed on Marissa's device weeks ago, he followed her movements in real time. The app showed a small blinking dot moving steadily across the map, heading toward a part of town Ethan rarely visited. He tailed her car at a safe distance, his heart pounding with every turn. She pulled into the parking lot of a boutique hotel, far from their home and the supposed charity event she had mentioned earlier that week. Ethan parked his car across the street, lowering his seat to avoid detection. He watched as Marissa stepped out of her car, smoothing her dress nervously. Her phone buzzed in her hand, and she smiled as she typed a response. Moments later, a man emerged from the hotel lobby. Ethan's chest tightened as he recognized him from the camera footage. Liam Hartford. Tall, confident, and far too familiar with his wife. Marissa approached Liam, her expression lighting up in a way Ethan hadn't seen in years. She hugged him, the gesture lingering far longer than necessary. Liam said something, making her laugh, a sound that used to fill Ethan's world with light but now felt like a cruel mockery. Ethan gripped his phone tightly, every instinct in his body screaming at him to confront them. But Patrick's words echoed in his mind. You need more than a moment of anger. You need proof. He took a deep breath, forcing himself to stay hidden, his hands trembling as he opened the camera on his phone. He captured every second. Marissa's laughter, Liam's hand on her back, the way they disappeared into the hotel together. He sat there for what felt like an eternity, his thoughts spiraling. Every memory he had with Marissa now felt like a lie. The woman he had loved, the woman he had built a life with, was gone. Or maybe she had never been real. Maybe he had loved a version of her that only existed in his mind. Hours passed before Marissa re-emerged, her smile replaced by a look of calm satisfaction. Liam walked her to her car, leaning in close to say something before stepping away. She drove off, oblivious to Ethan watching from the shadows. Ethan didn't follow her home. He needed time to think. Instead, he drove aimlessly through the city, the weight of what he had seen pressing down on him. His phone buzzed. Patrick again. Ethan let it ring. He couldn't explain this over the phone. He couldn't even explain it to himself. Eventually, Ethan parked by the river, staring at the water as the sun began to set. He replayed the footage on his phone, each frame slicing deeper into his heart. The evidence was undeniable. Marissa wasn't just hiding something. She was living a life he wasn't a part of. As the city lights flickered to life around him, Ethan finally called Patrick. His voice was hollow as he spoke. It's real, Patrick. She's with him. Patrick was silent for a moment before replying. I'm sorry, Ethan. What's your next move? Ethan closed his eyes, the answer clear but impossible to say. I don't know yet, but I'm not letting this go. Ethan stirred his coffee absent-mindedly, staring out the kitchen window at the backyard where his two children played. The early morning light cast a golden glow over their small, carefree world, a world he felt was slipping further from his grasp. Marissa had left for work earlier than usual, her goodbye kiss on his cheek as hollow as the promises she had been making. Ethan felt the weight of the secrets he now carried. It wasn't just his pain anymore. He could see its shadows beginning to creep into the lives of his children. Dad, can we have waffles for breakfast tomorrow? Ethan's 8-year-old son Oliver asked, bounding into the kitchen with his younger sister Lucy close behind. Lucy held her favorite stuffed rabbit tightly, her wide eyes fixed on Ethan. Waffles, huh? Ethan said, forcing a smile as he tousled Oliver's hair. We'll see. You guys sure love giving me extra work. You make them the best, Oliver replied with a grin, but then his expression shifted. Mommy doesn't make waffles anymore. She said she's too busy. The words hit Ethan like a punch to the gut. He swallowed hard, trying to keep his voice steady. Mommy's been working really hard lately, he said softly, not wanting to let his emotions show. She loves you guys, you know that, right? Oliver shrugged, his eyes falling to the floor. I guess, but she's never home for dinner anymore. And when she is, she's always on her phone. Lucy, sensing the tension, clutched Ethan's arm. Daddy, you're not going anywhere, are you? Ethan knelt down to her level, his heart breaking at the fear in her voice. No, sweetheart, I'm not going anywhere, I promise. Lucy's lip trembled as she nodded, burying her face in his shoulder. Ethan held her tightly, blinking back tears. How could he shield them from the storm brewing between him and Marissa? How could he protect their innocence when every day brought him closer to a truth that would shatter their family? Later that evening, while the kids were coloring at the dining table, Ethan heard Oliver whispering to Lucy, "Do you think Mommy likes that man more than Daddy?" Ethan's breath caught in his throat, his hand freezing mid-motion as he wiped the counter. He forced himself to keep moving, not wanting to alert them that he was listening. "Who?" Lucy whispered back, her voice barely audible. "The one she talks to on the phone. I heard her laughing yesterday. She doesn't laugh like that with Daddy anymore." Lucy paused, then said softly, "Maybe it's because Daddy works too much." Ethan gripped the edge of the counter, his knuckles white. Every word felt like a dagger. His children were noticing. They were piecing together the cracks in their parents' relationship, cracks that he had tried so hard to conceal. "Okay, bedtime," Ethan said, his voice more cheerful than he felt. He didn't want them to linger on these thoughts. As he tucked them in, he made sure to kiss each of them on the forehead, lingering just a little longer than usual. "Good night, Daddy," Lucy said, her small hand clutching his. "Don't let the monsters get us." Ethan smiled, his throat tightening. "I won't, Lucy. I promise." But as he turned out the light and closed the door to their room, the weight of his own unspoken fears pressed down on him. The real monsters weren't under their beds. They were in the lies that surrounded them, the lies that threatened to tear their family apart. Ethan sat in the living room that night, staring at the footage from the hidden cameras. Marissa's laughter echoed through the screen, a sound that once brought him joy, but now filled him with dread. For the first time, he questioned whether he was strong enough to face what was coming. He wasn't just fighting for himself anymore. He was fighting for them, Oliver and Lucy, and he couldn't fail. Ethan stared blankly at his cup of coffee as the sunlight filtered through the kitchen window. The sleepless nights and endless cycle of doubt were wearing him thin. He replayed Marissa's actions over and over in his mind, trying to make sense of how they had come to this point. The laughter, the lies, the text messages, it all felt like a puzzle with pieces missing. His thoughts were interrupted by the sound of the doorbell. He opened the door to find Mrs. Gloria Henson standing on the porch, her hands clasped tightly around a casserole dish. The retired teacher from next door often brought over baked goods, a kind but unnecessary gesture Ethan had always appreciated. Today, though, her eyes were sharp, almost nervous. "Morning, Ethan," Gloria said, offering a strained smile. "I thought I'd bring you this, my famous tuna casserole. Figured you could use a little comfort food." "Thanks, Gloria," Ethan said, stepping aside to let her in. She hovered near the door, shifting her weight uneasily. "Listen," Gloria began, her voice quieter now. "There's something I need to talk to you about. I've been wrestling with whether I should even bring it up, but I think you need to know." Ethan's chest tightened. He motioned toward the couch and they sat down, the casserole forgotten on the coffee table. "What is it?" "I saw Marissa last week," Gloria said, her tone measured but deliberate. "She was at that new restaurant downtown, Sterling's. It's a nice place, very romantic." Ethan's pulse quickened. He gripped the arm of the couch. "And?" "She wasn't alone," Gloria continued. "She was with a man I didn't recognize. They seemed close, laughing, leaning in toward each other. I thought maybe it was a friend or a colleague, but then he reached across the table and touched her hand. Ethan, I'm so sorry, but it wasn't the kind of touch you give a friend." The room seemed to spin around him as Gloria's words sank in. He struggled to speak, his voice coming out hoarse. "You're sure? It was her?" "I'm sure," Gloria said firmly. "I didn't want to assume the worst, but I know what I saw. And when I saw how happy she looked, it didn't sit right with me. I know this isn't my business, but I care about you and the kids. You deserve to know." Ethan nodded, his jaw tight. "Thank you for telling me," It means more than you know." Gloria reached out, placing a comforting hand on his arm. "Ethan, you're a good man. Whatever's going on, I hope you find the strength to get through it." After Gloria left, Ethan sat in silence, the casserole untouched. Her words replayed in his mind, confirming everything he already knew but wished wasn't true. Marissa wasn't just slipping away. She'd already gone. Her betrayal wasn't just in text messages or secret meetings. It was public, brazen. She had stepped out of their life and into someone else's. That night, Ethan sat in the darkened living room, reviewing the footage from the cameras. He watched Marissa, her face illuminated by her phone's screen, typing messages he couldn't see. He thought of Gloria's words, the image of Marissa laughing with another man at a candle-lit table. The confirmation cut deeper than he'd expected. It wasn't just about him anymore. It was about the family they had built and the children who trusted her completely. He opened his phone and scrolled through his photos, pausing on a picture of Marissa holding Oliver and Lucy at the park. Her smile, bright and carefree, felt like a mockery of the woman she had become. Ethan clenched his fists, the pain transforming into a simmering resolve. If Marissa thought she could hide behind lies and secrets, she was wrong. The truth was already unraveling, and Ethan was determined to see it through no matter the cost. Ethan sat in his car, gripping the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles turned white. He was parked across from Sterling's, the restaurant Gloria had mentioned. The evening air hung heavy with a suffocating stillness, mirroring the turmoil inside him. His phone sat on the passenger seat, its screen displaying the live feed from the hidden cameras. He had combed through every second of footage, dissecting Marissa's every movement, every glance. The truth was no longer a question. It was a glaring, undeniable reality. But tonight, he needed more. He needed closure. Marissa had left the house an hour ago, claiming she was meeting a friend for a late dinner. Ethan knew better. He'd watched her meticulously pick out her outfit, apply her makeup with more care than he'd seen in years, and text someone repeatedly. Now, as he stared at the entrance to the restaurant, his pulse quickened. He didn't know what he would do if he saw her with him, but he knew he couldn't stay away. The door to the restaurant opened, and there she was. Marissa stepped out, her laughter floating across the lot like a haunting melody. Beside her was Liam. The sight of them together felt like a blow to Ethan's chest. They walked side by side, close enough that their hands brushed. Liam leaned in, saying something that made Marissa laugh again, the sound cutting through Ethan like glass. Ethan grabbed his phone and snapped several photos, his hand trembling. His mind screamed at him to get out of the car, to confront them, but his body stayed frozen. He knew Patrick was right. Anger wouldn't solve this. He needed to keep control no matter how much it hurt. They headed toward the parking lot, and Ethan followed, keeping his distance. Liam opened the passenger door of his car for Marissa, a chivalrous act that made Ethan's stomach churn. Once they were both inside, the car pulled out of the lot and Ethan started his own engine. He followed them through the quiet streets, his headlights dimmed to avoid drawing attention. Every mile felt like an eternity, his mind racing with possibilities. They stopped at a boutique hotel, the same one Ethan had seen on the tracker before. Liam parked and they exited the car together. Marissa glanced around briefly, her expression cautious but not guilty. They entered the hotel through a side entrance, disappearing from view. Ethan parked a block away and stepped out of the car, his heart pounding. He didn't know what he would find, but he needed to see it for himself. He walked briskly to the hotel, entering through the lobby. The receptionist barely glanced at him as he moved past, his focus fixed on the elevator bank. He waited for the elevator to descend, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. When the doors opened, he stepped inside, pressing the button for the third floor. As the elevator climbed, his resolve solidified. He didn't care about the consequences anymore. He needed answers. When the doors slid open, he stepped into the hallway, the muted sound of a TV playing somewhere down the corridor. He walked slowly, his footsteps echoing on the carpeted floor. Then he saw it. Room 314. The door was slightly ajar, the soft hum of voices drifting out. Ethan approached, his heart pounding so loudly it drowned out everything else. He peered inside, and there they were. Marissa sat on the edge of the bed, her hand resting lightly on Liam's knee. They were laughing, their faces close, their intimacy undeniable. Ethan's vision blurred as a surge of emotion overtook him. He turned away, his breathing ragged, and walked back toward the elevator. He couldn't confront them, not here, not now, but he had what he needed. The lies were laid bare, and the truth was a knife that cut deeper than he'd thought possible. When he reached his car, Ethan sat in silence, his hands gripping the wheel. He didn't cry, he didn't scream. He simply sat, the weight of everything crashing down around him. Tonight, the facade was gone. All that remained were the shattered pieces of the life he once knew. Ethan sat in the living room, the dim light of the lamp casting long shadows on the walls. His phone lay on the coffee table, the evidence displayed like an accusation that filled the air. Photos, videos, every damning detail of Marissa's affair. The weight of it pressed down on him, suffocating and inescapable. Tonight, there would be no more pretending, no more waiting. He had to confront her. The sound of the front door opening broke the silence, and Ethan straightened. Marissa stepped inside, her heels clicking against the hardwood floor as she set her bag down on the counter. "Hey," she said casually, glancing toward him. "You're up late." Ethan's hands tightened into fists. "We need to talk," he said, his voice calm but edged with steel. Marissa hesitated, sensing the shift in his tone. "About what?" she asked, forcing a smile. "Is everything okay?" Ethan gestured to the couch. "Sit." She blinked, her smile faltering. "Ethan, what's going on?" "Sit," he repeated, his voice leaving no room for argument. Marissa slowly moved to the couch, perching on the edge as if ready to bolt. Ethan picked up his phone, scrolling to the folder containing the evidence. He handed it to her without a word. Her brow furrowed as she took the phone, but as she began to scroll through the photos, her face drained of color. Her breath hitched, and she glanced up at him, her eyes wide with fear. "Ethan, I can explain." "Explain?" he said, his voice rising. "Explain what, Marissa? The secret meetings, the dinners, the nights in that hotel room." Tears welled in her eyes, but Ethan wasn't moved. "You've been lying to me," he continued, his voice trembling with rage. "To me, to our kids. Every time you smiled at me, every time you said you loved me, it was a lie." Marissa shook her head, her hands trembling as she placed the phone on the table. "It's not what you think." "Don't," Ethan snapped, cutting her off. "Don't insult me by pretending this is something it's not. I've seen the footage. I've seen everything. So spare me whatever excuse you're about to make." She buried her face in her hands, her shoulders shaking. "I didn't mean for this to happen," she choked out. "It was a mistake. I was lonely, Ethan. You were always so busy, so distant. I felt invisible." Ethan laughed bitterly, the sound harsh and devoid of humor. "Lonely? You think I wasn't lonely? I worked day and night to give you and the kids everything, and this is how you repay me?" "I'm sorry," she whispered, her voice breaking. "I'm so sorry." "Sorry?" Ethan's voice cracked under the weight of his anger. "Sorry doesn't erase what you've done. Sorry doesn't fix this." Marissa looked up at him, her face streaked with tears. "Please, Ethan. We can fix this. I'll end it. I'll do whatever it takes." Ethan stared at her, his heart aching with a pain he couldn't describe. "How do you fix something like this?" he asked, his voice raw. "How do I look at you and not see him? How do I trust you again?" She didn't answer, her silence more damning than any words she could have said. Ethan stood, his body trembling as he turned away. "I need space," he said quietly. "I can't even look at you right now." "Ethan, please," she started, but he raised a hand, silencing her. "Go upstairs," he said, his voice cold. "And don't talk to me right now. I need time." Marissa hesitated, then rose and disappeared up the stairs, her footsteps fading into the distance. Ethan sank back onto the couch, his head in his hands. The house was silent again, but it wasn't the comforting silence he had once cherished. This silence was heavy, oppressive, filled with the echoes of everything that had been broken. Ethan closed his eyes, the tears he had been holding back finally spilling over. He didn't know what tomorrow would bring, but one thing was certain: nothing would ever be the same. Ethan sat at his desk, the weight of the confrontation still bearing down on him. His home had become a battlefield of silence, with Marissa retreating to their bedroom while he spent his nights in the study. The stack of legal documents Patrick had helped him gather sat untouched, each page a reminder of the decision he didn't want to make. But tonight, Ethan wasn't looking at divorce papers. He was poring over bank statements and credit card bills. Patrick had given him a lead, a single question that refused to leave Ethan's mind. "Are you sure this is the first time?" The idea that Marissa's betrayal might not be an isolated mistake, but part of a larger pattern, gnawed at him. And as Ethan reviewed their finances, he began to notice irregularities. Withdrawals he didn't recognize, purchases he couldn't account for. One particular transaction stood out, a $5,000 wire transfer made 2 years ago. Ethan's stomach churned as he cross-referenced the date with his calendar. It had been during the week he was away on a business trip, a trip Marissa had insisted he take despite his hesitation. He remembered how oddly distant she had been when he returned, brushing off his questions with claims of stress. Ethan dug deeper, his fingers trembling as he searched through old emails and receipts. A name began to appear repeatedly. Liam Hartford. It wasn't just recent dinners and hotel stays. Liam had been connected to Marissa for years. The evidence painted a picture of a relationship that had been hidden in plain sight, carefully woven into the fabric of their lives. Ethan leaned back in his chair, his mind reeling. He thought about the times Marissa had accused him of working too much, of being distant. Had those accusations been a way to deflect attention from her own actions? He couldn't reconcile the woman he had loved with the one revealed by the trail of lies. The life they had built together now felt like a facade, a carefully constructed illusion. The sound of footsteps pulled Ethan from his thoughts. He looked up to see Marissa standing in the doorway, her face pale and drawn. "Ethan," she said quietly, "can we talk?" He gestured for her to sit, his expression unreadable. "What is it?" She hesitated, wringing her hands. "I know I've hurt you, and I know you're angry, but there are things you don't understand." Ethan's jaw tightened. "Then explain it to me. Help me understand why you threw away everything we built." Marissa's voice cracked as she began to speak. "It wasn't supposed to happen like this. I didn't mean for it to get this far, but I was lost, Ethan. After Lucy was born, I felt like I wasn't myself anymore. I felt invisible." "You felt invisible?" Ethan said, his voice rising. "Do you have any idea how hard I worked to keep everything together while you found yourself? I gave you space, Marissa. I gave you trust. And you used it to lie to me." Tears streamed down her face, but Ethan didn't relent. "And Liam, how long has he been in the picture? How far back does this go?" Marissa looked away, her silence confirming what Ethan already knew. His heart sank further, the depth of her betrayal becoming more unbearable with each passing moment. Finally, she whispered, "It started before Lucy was born." Ethan's breath caught. He felt like the ground beneath him had given way, leaving him suspended in a free fall of despair. "You've been lying to me for years," he said, his voice barely audible. Marissa nodded, her face crumpling. "I'm sorry, Ethan. I never meant to hurt you. I didn't know how to stop." Ethan stood, his hands clenched at his sides. "You didn't know how to stop? That's your excuse?" He shook his head, his voice breaking. "You didn't just betray me. You betrayed our family." Marissa sobbed quietly, but Ethan couldn't bring himself to comfort her. He turned away, his mind racing. The truth was out, but it brought no relief, only the hollow ache of something irreparably broken. Ethan sat in his car, gripping the steering wheel as the city lights blurred through the windshield. He had spent the past week oscillating between anger and despair, trying to make sense of everything Marissa had revealed. But tonight was different. Tonight, the pain had crystallized into something sharp and clear: revenge. He had prepared meticulously, gathering every piece of evidence he needed. The photos, the footage, the financial records. All of it painted a picture of betrayal so complete that it left no room for doubt. But Ethan wasn't just seeking justice for himself. Liam Hartford, the man who had stolen his wife, would pay as well. Earlier that day, Ethan had contacted a private investigator recommended by Patrick. The investigator, a sharp, no-nonsense woman named Clara, had wasted no time digging into Liam's life. What she uncovered was exactly what Ethan needed. Liam's gym business was failing. He was drowning in debt and using his charm to manipulate wealthy clients, like Marissa, for financial gain. The knowledge sent a cold thrill through Ethan's veins. Liam wasn't just a homewrecker, he was a predator. Ethan walked into his office building, the folder of evidence tucked under his arm. His first stop was Patrick's desk. "You're sure about this?" Patrick asked, his tone low but firm. "Positive," Ethan replied, his jaw tight. "This isn't just about me anymore. This guy is using people, and he's going to get what's coming to him." Patrick nodded, handing Ethan a USB drive. "This has everything Clara sent over. Financial records, emails, even some incriminating messages from his staff. If you're going to do this, make sure it's airtight." Ethan took the drive and headed to a quiet corner of the office. He composed an anonymous email and attached the evidence, addressing it to a local news outlet that had recently covered a story on predatory business practices. He hesitated for only a moment before hitting send. It was done. The fallout was almost immediate. By the next morning, Liam's gym was the center of a media firestorm. Articles exposing his financial misconduct spread like wildfire, and his clients began to distance themselves. Ethan watched the news reports with a grim sense of satisfaction. For the first time in weeks, he felt a flicker of control. But Ethan wasn't done. He knew that Marissa's involvement with Liam would come to light eventually, and he had no intention of shielding her from the consequences. When she walked into the kitchen that evening, her face pale and strained, Ethan didn't wait for her to speak. "Did you see the news?" he asked, his tone cold. Marissa nodded, her eyes wide with fear. "Ethan, I know you were funding him," Ethan interrupted, slamming a printout of her financial transactions onto the counter. "I know you gave him thousands of dollars while lying to me about our finances." Tears welled in Marissa's eyes, but Ethan didn't relent. "This isn't just about us anymore. You brought him into our lives. You risked everything. For what? For someone who was using you?" "I didn't know," Marissa whispered, her voice shaking. "I didn't know he was like that." "And you didn't care to find out," Ethan shot back. "You didn't care about the damage you were doing to this family." Marissa sank into a chair, her head in her hands. "I'm sorry," she sobbed. "I was stupid, reckless. I didn't think—" "No, you didn't," Ethan said, his voice firm. "And now you're going to face the consequences." The weight of his words hung in the air as Marissa broke down completely. Ethan turned away, his heart heavy but resolute. He knew this wasn't the end. There was still so much to untangle, so much pain to confront. But for now, he had taken the first step in reclaiming his life, and he wasn't looking back. Ethan stood silently in the hallway outside Oliver's room, the sound of muffled sobs breaking through the wooden door. His chest tightened as he raised his hand to knock, but hesitated. How could he comfort his son when his own heart felt like it had been torn apart? "Oliver," Ethan called softly, pushing the door open. His 8-year-old son sat on the floor, his knees drawn up to his chest, his face buried in his arms. Lucy, clutching her stuffed rabbit, sat beside him, her small hand resting on his shoulder. She looked up at Ethan, her wide, tear-filled eyes pleading for answers he didn't have. "Daddy," Lucy whispered, "is it true? Are you and Mommy not going to be together anymore?" Ethan's heart shattered at her question. He knelt down, pulling both children into his arms. "Come here," he said, his voice trembling. They clung to him, their small bodies shaking as they cried. "Listen to me. No matter what happens between Mommy and me, I will always love you, both of you. That will never change." "But why?" Oliver choked out, looking up at him. "Why can't you and Mommy fix it? Why can't we just be a family again?" Ethan sighed, struggling to find the right words. "Sometimes grown-ups make mistakes," he said gently. "Big mistakes that are hard to fix. But none of this is your fault, okay? I need you to remember that. None of this is because of you." Oliver sniffled, wiping his face with the sleeve of his shirt. "I heard you and Mommy arguing. She said she was sorry. Can't you forgive her?" Ethan's throat tightened. He wanted to shield his children from the harsh realities of what had happened, but he also knew he couldn't lie to them. "Forgiveness is complicated," he said slowly. "It's not something that happens overnight, and even when you forgive someone, it doesn't always mean things can go back to the way they were." Lucy clung to him tighter, her voice small and frightened. "But what will happen to us?" Ethan kissed the top of her head, his tears finally spilling over. "You'll still have me," he said. "I'll always be here for you, I promise." That night, after the children had finally fallen asleep, Ethan sat in the living room, staring at the empty bottle of wine on the coffee table. Marissa had retreated upstairs, her presence a ghostly reminder of the life they once shared. He felt drained, hollow, as if the weight of the past weeks had finally caught up to him. His phone buzzed, breaking the silence. It was Patrick. Ethan hesitated before answering, his voice low. "Yeah? How are you holding up?" Patrick asked. Ethan rubbed his temples, exhaustion evident in his tone. "The kids are struggling. They know something's wrong, but they don't understand." Patrick sighed on the other end. "Kids are resilient, Ethan. They'll get through this. They have you." "Do they?" Ethan said bitterly. "I feel like I'm failing them. I can't give them the family they deserve." "You're not failing," Patrick said firmly. "You're protecting them, and that's what matters." After the call ended, Ethan leaned back, staring at the ceiling. The truth was, he didn't feel like a protector. He felt like a man desperately trying to hold together the broken pieces of his children's world while his own crumbled around him. But as he looked at a framed photo of Oliver and Lucy on the mantel, he made a silent vow. No matter how much pain he felt, no matter how hard it became, he would not let them fall. He would give them the stability, the love, and the support they needed, even if it meant putting his own feelings aside. Marissa sat alone at the kitchen table, the house eerily quiet. The only sounds were the faint hum of the refrigerator and the ticking of the clock on the wall. She stared at the cold cup of coffee in front of her, her hands wrapped around the mug as if it could anchor her. The emptiness around her mirrored the growing void in her life. The fallout had been swift and brutal. Liam had vanished the moment his reputation was destroyed, his once charming facade replaced by silence. Calls to his number went unanswered, his gym shuttered, and his social media accounts wiped clean. Marissa had been left with nothing but the fragments of a life she had shattered with her own hands. The news of her affair had spread quickly among their social circle. Friends she once considered close now avoided her, their polite smiles replaced by whispers and judgmental glances. At the grocery store, she caught snippets of conversations, her name spoken in hushed tones. Every encounter was a reminder of her mistakes, of the choices that had cost her everything. Ethan had remained distant, his presence a stark reminder of the trust she had betrayed. They barely spoke, their interactions limited to discussions about the children. He had moved into the guest room, a quiet but undeniable declaration that their marriage was over. Marissa's attempts to reach out were met with cold indifference. She couldn't blame him. She didn't deserve forgiveness. Marissa opened her journal, the one she had started after Ethan discovered the affair. It was filled with letters she would never send, confessions of guilt and regret that poured out of her in the stillness of the night. She flipped to a blank page and began to write, her hand trembling as the words spilled out. "Dear Ethan, I don't know if you'll ever read this, but I need to say it anyway. I'm sorry. I'm sorry for everything, for the lies, the pain, the destruction I caused. I know I can't undo the damage I've done, but I want you to know that I never stopped loving you. I made mistakes because I was weak, because I was scared, but none of that excuses what I did to you, to us. I see it now, every day, in the way you look at me, or don't look at me, in the way Oliver and Lucy ask questions I don't know how to answer. I see it in the way our home feels like a house filled with strangers. I hate myself for what I've done, Ethan. I don't know how to fix it, but I hope one day you'll find it in your heart to forgive me. Not for my sake, but for the sake of the life we built together. For the children who deserve better than this." Her tears smudged the ink, but she didn't stop writing. When she finally set the pen down, her chest felt heavy, as if the weight of her words had settled deep inside her. She closed the journal, her fingers lingering on the cover. That evening, as she prepared dinner for the children, she heard their laughter from the living room. It was a sound she hadn't heard in weeks. and it struck her like a blow. She peeked in and saw Ethan playing a board game with Oliver and Lucy, his smile genuine for the first time in what felt like forever. Marissa stepped back, her throat tightening. She didn't belong in that moment. Not anymore. Her mistakes had built a wall between her and the family she had once cherished, a wall she feared she would never break down. As the night wore on, Marissa retreated to the bedroom, alone with her thoughts. She knew the isolation was her punishment, but it didn't make it easier to bear. Every empty moment was filled with the echoes of what she had lost. She could only hope that one day her children would understand the love that still burned fiercely in her heart, a love she had failed to protect. Ethan stood in the backyard, the crisp morning air biting at his skin. The sun had just begun to rise, casting a soft glow over the garden. He watched as Lucy chased Oliver around the yard, their laughter filling the space with a warmth he hadn't felt in months. For a brief moment, he allowed himself to believe that things might one day feel normal again. But normal wasn't the right word. There was no returning to what had been. Ethan knew that. His world had shifted irrevocably, the foundation cracked, the pieces scattered. What he had now was something different, a blank slate, a chance to rebuild. And for the first time, he didn't feel entirely lost. The process of healing had begun slowly, almost imperceptibly. It started with small steps, leaving the house for a walk instead of pacing the living room, picking up the phone to call Patrick instead of sitting in silence. Over time, those steps turned into strides. Ethan began to carve out moments for himself, moments where he wasn't defined by the pain Marissa had caused or the responsibilities that weighed on him as a father. He started reading again, something he hadn't done in years. He went to the gym, finding solace in the rhythm of his workouts. One evening, Patrick invited him over for dinner, a rare moment of light amidst the shadows. As they shared a meal, Patrick offered a piece of advice that stuck with him. "You're not just healing for yourself," Patrick said, his tone gentle but firm. "You're healing for them, too. They need to see you strong, Ethan. That's what will help them the most." Those words echoed in Ethan's mind as he watched his children play. He had made mistakes, so many mistakes. He had been distant, consumed by work, blind to the cracks forming in his marriage. But he wouldn't let those mistakes define him. Not anymore. Inside the house, the tension with Marissa remained palpable. They communicated when necessary, their conversations polite but hollow. Ethan had stopped expecting answers from her. The anger that once consumed him had dulled into something quieter, something heavier. It wasn't forgiveness, not yet, but it was a step toward letting go. Marissa had asked for another chance, but Ethan couldn't give it to her. Not now, and maybe not ever. The trust they had built was gone, and he wasn't sure it could be rebuilt. Still, he found himself hoping she would find her own way to heal, for the sake of their children, if nothing else. One afternoon, as Ethan sorted through the clutter in the garage, he found an old photo album tucked away in a dusty box. He opened it, flipping through pages filled with memories of happier times, birthdays, vacations, moments of laughter frozen in time. He paused on a photo of himself and Marissa holding a newborn Lucy, their faces glowing with joy and exhaustion. He traced the edge of the photo with his finger, a bittersweet smile tugging at his lips. The love they had shared was real once. That was something he couldn't deny, even if it had been lost along the way. Ethan closed the album and set it aside, a quiet resolve settling over him. The past was the past, and while it would always be a part of him, it didn't have to define his future. His focus now was on Oliver and Lucy, on giving them a life filled with stability, love, and hope. That evening, as the children curled up on the couch beside him, Ethan felt a flicker of peace. Lucy rested her head on his shoulder, her voice soft as she asked, "Daddy, are we going to be okay?" Ethan kissed the top of her head, his voice steady as he replied, "Yes, sweetheart, we're going to be okay." And for the first time, he truly believed it. The spring sun cast a golden glow over the park as Ethan watched Oliver and Lucy race each other across the grass. Their laughter carried on the breeze, mingling with the distant sounds of children playing and the soft rustle of leaves. Ethan sat on a bench, his hands resting loosely on his lap, his thoughts a quiet hum beneath the serenity of the moment. It had been 6 months since everything had come crashing down. 6 months since the truth had unraveled their lives and forced them all to start over. Ethan had moved into a small but cozy townhouse a few blocks away from the family home, creating a new space for him and the kids to share. It wasn't perfect, but it was theirs, and slowly it was beginning to feel like home. Marissa, by mutual agreement, had stayed in the house. Her relationship with Ethan remained strained, but they had managed to create a fragile truce for the sake of the children. They communicated civilly, coordinated schedules, and occasionally shared a meal on special occasions. But the deep connection they once had was gone, replaced by a cautious distance. Ethan's healing had been far from linear. There were days when the weight of betrayal still pressed down on him, when the memories of happier times collided with the reality of what had been lost. But there were also days like today, when the simple joy of being with his children reminded him of what truly mattered. Lucy ran over, her cheeks flushed from the exertion. "Daddy, did you see? I beat Oliver this time." Ethan smiled, scooping her up into his arms. "I saw, sweetheart, you're getting faster every day." Oliver joined them, panting but grinning. "She only won because I tripped," Lucy giggled, and Ethan ruffled Oliver's hair. "Maybe next time you'll watch where you're going." As the afternoon wore on, the three of them sat beneath a sprawling oak tree, sharing a picnic of sandwiches and fruit. Lucy leaned against Ethan's side, her small hand clasping his. "Daddy," she said softly, "are we happy now?" Ethan looked down at her, his chest tightening. "I think we're getting there, Lucy," he said honestly. "What do you think?" She nodded, her eyes bright. "I think we are." The word stayed with him long after the picnic was packed up and they had returned to the townhouse. That night, after tucking the kids into bed, Ethan sat alone in the living room. A framed photo of the three of them from their trip to the park rested on the coffee table. He picked it up, running his thumb over the glass. He knew the road ahead wouldn't be without its challenges. There would be questions to answer, wounds to heal, and a future to navigate that looked nothing like the one he had envisioned. But as he looked at the photo, he felt a quiet sense of hope. They were building something new, something imperfect but honest, and that was enough. As he set the photo back on the table, Ethan leaned back, letting out a long breath. The past would always be a part of him, a chapter in the story of his life. But it no longer defined him. He had learned to let go, to find strength in his pain and purpose in his love for his children. For the first time in what felt like forever, Ethan closed his eyes and allowed himself to dream. Not of what had been lost, but of what could still be found.